very proud of his home. This is the only home he ever designed and built for himself. We have a tour that we would like to offer you right now. This is a program that we've been doing for about 13 years. Pretty sure it's 13 years. And we do it for local school children. Generally, we target 4th and 5th graders. They come and take a short tour of the house. They see a performance of the Just So stories told in the same room where Mr. Kipling wrote them for his children. We do this once a year, so we've just spent the last 3 days entertaining about 300 school children. So if we look a little haggard, another cup of coffee, we're going to be great. So if you would like to come on the guided tour, we're going to start in the kitchen. You don't have to come if you don't want to, but please join me. Second.
I'm sorry. That's all right.
Oh, camels.
Mrs. Kipling was very protective of her husband's privacy. Anyone who wanted to see Mr. Kipling had to get through Mrs. Kipling first. Apparently that was not easy. And so she was sometimes referred to as the Dragon Lady, and this room was sometimes referred to as the Dragon's Chamber. Now this is a lithograph of Mr. Kipling, done while he lived here at Nalaka. He is, again, all of 28 years old, the most famous author in the world. It was done with his cousin Philip Burns Jones, who was a very famous portrait artist. And the original of this hangs in the National Portrait Gallery in London, England. And Mrs. Vogt has actually had the opportunity to see it.
Yes. I haven't been there for recent years, but I don't think they changed things in that gallery very much. That portrait hangs in a gallery amidst kings and queens and clergy people, most of them garbed in rather sensational clothing. And there's Mr. Kipling in his rumpled jacket, very rumpled. The pocket is kind of turned in, you notice. Looking out at the window, you'll see him in there. And I always tell the children, look at the desk. Do you see a computer? There were typewriters. And Mark Twain used a typewriter, but Mr. Kipling didn't like typewriters because he said they couldn't spell. So, no typewriter, there's a pipe. I'd pass over the pipe. Finally, I'll get a child to say, what's that little globe on the desk? The globe. If any of you could find a globe like that, and give it to this house, I personally, really, imagine. So I say to the children, where was he born? And they know he was born in India. He wrote about Africa. He wrote about countries all over the world, sitting up here in Dummerston, Vermont. The globe was what kept him centered.
This is a picture of Mr. Kipling picking up his mail. This is on Main Street in Brattleboro. He had to bring the sleigh to pick up all those bundles filled with fan mail, basically. He was so famous that it generated a lot of fan mail. He actually got so much mail that he convinced the U.S. Post Office to give him his very own post office, which was located at the bottom of Black Mountain Road where Radio Shack is today. That used to be the Waite family farm, and one of the rooms in the farm was dedicated just to Mr. Kipling and his mail. Now, once a month, Mr. Kipling would sit down at his desk and he would pay all of his bills. He would pay for the coal and the servants and the groceries, and very quickly he discovered that not one single check was being cashed. And this went on for a long time. And the reason why is because his autograph was worth more than the checks that he was writing. Now, wouldn't we like to have that problem? So Mrs. Kipling ended up taking over the finances of the family, which of course was very unusual in 1892. It was not generally the woman in the family who took care of the family finances, but she was very capable and very good. Eventually Mrs. Kipling came up with the bright idea that she would sell Mr. Kipling's autograph. She sold them for $3 a piece, and she donated all of the money to the Fresh Air Fund. Is everyone in this room familiar with the Fresh Air Fund? He takes children from the inner city out to the country for a couple weeks a year. They get to enjoy all the things that are not a big deal to us. Swimming in a river or a lake, sitting on a bonfire, hiking, camping, canoeing. The Kiplings loved children. Loved children. Adults, not so much. But children were always welcome at Nalaka, and we think that the Kiplings would be very happy to know that children are still welcome at Nalaka. And we're going to have a chance to ask Mr. Kipling about that because he has come back. He's in his study right now working on a new manuscript. So the next room we're going to go into is Mr. Kipling.
Pick out a little castle you want to stay in.
I love that. It looks like a
Pineapple.
pineapple. I've just got really sleepy.
Ow.
We were just talking about windows in the kitchen, and when you have a chance to go upstairs, there are a lot of windows like that where the window's way up high, you can't see out of it, but allows the light to carry in. There's one in the bathroom like that. In the Kipling's bedroom, there's a closet. If you open the door, it actually has a window in it that, again, allows the light to carry into the closet. This is the Kipling's original dining room table. This is where they would have their evening meals. The children, of course, would have eaten in the kitchen with the servants. Only adults would have eaten at this table for the evening meal. The chairs were too fragile, though, so we had to have them reproduced. But when we reproduced these chairs, we used the same material that the Kiplings used, which is horsehair. Now, every single evening, 365 days a year, when it was time to eat the evening meal, Mrs. Kipling sent Mr. Kipling upstairs to get washed up and dressed. And he was not allowed to come back downstairs until he either had his tuxedo or his finest suit and tie. She would put on a very formal long gown, and this was dinner for them every single night. Mrs. Kipling was born in Albany, New York. They sometimes say she was more British than her husband. This piece of furniture right behind you, folks, is a sideboard that was made by a very famous furniture maker named Lockwood de Forest. He was trying to revive traditional Indian craftsmanship in America. The panels were hand-carved in India. They were brought to New York City and fashioned into this sideboard, which was then given to the Kiplings as a gift. Most of his pieces are now museum pieces. There are very few that are privately owned. So every now and then we have someone who wants to come and see it, photograph it, measure it, look at it, and they're horrified when they realize it is still in use today. And not only that, but in a vacation home, you know? I don't know if everyone is familiar with the Landmark Trust. We are a charity whose mission is historic preservation. We rescue historically significant homes that have fallen into disrepair. We restore them to what they once were and then rent them out for vacation purposes. We do not try and make the homes new. We do what is called conservative repair. So if we can use the same door or the same window or the same paneling, we will. So far, the Landmark Trust has rescued 190 properties worldwide: England, Scotland, Wales, Italy, France, and the U.S. We have 4 now, and soon to be 5 here in the U.S. Once the house, pardon?
What's the new one?
The new one will be the coachman's house next door, which we call the carriage house. That's where Matthew Howard and his family lived. The Kiplings had a difficult time hiring servants locally because they insisted that they wear uniforms. And the local kids, girls and boys, men and women around here didn't want to wear uniforms. So most of their help came from England. So they advertised in England for a single man. Matthew Howard answered the ad and he came over here. And very soon, well, they needed a gardener. Well, so he brought someone else over. Well, then they needed someone else, so he brought someone else over. Turned out he was married with 8 children. And they all ended up coming eventually and living in the carriage house. That is a 2-bedroom, 1-bath house. Where they put all those kids is a mystery to us even today. Once we restore the homes, we then rent them out for vacation purposes. Landmark Trust philosophy is that museum houses do not work. They are constantly fundraising. once you see a museum house, chances are very good you won't come back. But if you get to stay in a museum house and sleep in Mr. Kipling's bed and bathe in his bathtub and kind of soak up the history, hopefully you will embrace historic preservation. You will then support it, because there is no state or federal funding for historic preservation in this country, unlike most other countries in the world. So that is their philosophy, and so far it works really well. This room, if we could go into, we would. This room is called the loggia, which is an Italian word for porch. And you just want to show them this one little pocket. It has all these really neat pocket doors. And when you... Sorry, Allison. When you close all the pocket doors, and the window there in the front, it's got a storm window on it now, and then the regular window is behind it. You close all the pocket doors, and that window actually slides up into the ceiling. You feel like you're on a porch. It has the shingles on the inside of the house, whereas normally you would see them on the outside of the house. This was Mr. Kipling's favorite room of all of the rooms in the house. He called that room the joy of the house. And as a family, they spent a lot of time in this room. After the evening meal, Mrs. Kipling would write in her diary, which she did every day of her life. And interestingly enough, when she passed away, she insisted that her daughter Elsie destroy all of her diaries. Can you imagine the history in those diaries?
What a terrible thing.
Mr. Kipling would write letters, read, and he would tell stories to his children. Basically, they spent really nice family time in this room. Down in the corner of the property, if you look out the window there, you'll see the very first tennis court ever built in the state of Vermont. It was built in 1894. It's a clay court which we maintain even today. So when you come and rent the house and stay for the weekend, bring your tennis racket so that you can play some tennis. In 1894, the Kiplings had a guest who came for Thanksgiving dinner, and his name was Arthur Conan Doyle. Now, as you all know, he wrote the Sherlock Holmes mysteries, and he was a very good friend of Mr. Kipling. And it was actually Arthur Conan Doyle who introduced skiing to the world. He was spending time in Switzerland with his wife, who was recovering from an ailment, and he met these two brothers who were horsing around with wooden skis and climbing up into the Swiss Alps and skiing down, and he thought this was about the neatest thing he'd ever seen in his life. So he took it upon himself to literally introduce skiing to the world. So he brought Mr. Kipling a pair of these skis that he had been playing around with. We have pictures of Mr. Kipling in his suit and tie and his top hat skiing out here in the meadow right in front of Malacca. And as far as we can tell, they were the very first people ever to ski in the state of Vermont, which is interesting. So this man born in India and this other man born in Scotland were actually the first ones to ski here in Vermont. Mr. Doyle also brought his golf clubs with him. Golf was known in America, but not widely. And it was Thanksgiving, so there was snow on the ground. Vermont was mostly deforested due to sheep farming, so it was open pretty much as far as you could see. Conan Doyle wrote home after his trip here saying that the only thing that stopped the golf ball was a friendly stone wall or tree. Otherwise, that golf ball could go for miles. And they lost quite a few, apparently. So Mr. Kipling ended up painting the gulls red, so that he could keep better track of them, and he is now credited with inventing snow golf. Out that door is the small patio I was telling you about, and when you sit on that patio, you really can get the sensation of being on a ship. We're up high, and it's all open out in front of us. You can almost imagine the Atlantic Ocean out there. The Kiplings designed their house for privacy. The entrance is on the back side of the house. All of the stairways and hallways are on the back side of the house. All of the bedrooms and other rooms are on this side of the house. And even though we're on the first floor, we're actually on the second floor, and that's for privacy. They didn't want people spying in their windows on them. While the house was being built, they lived down the road on the SIT World Learning Campus in a small cottage called Bliss Cottage. And while they lived there, they had a terrible time with skunks in the basement. So Mr. Kipling thought hard about designing his house, and he built himself a skunk-proof basement. The foundation of this house is formidable. Nothing is getting through the foundation on this house. It was also quite small, While they lived there, their first daughter Josephine was born, and at night when it was time for her to go to bed, they opened up the top drawer of the dresser, and that's where Josephine slept. When the Holbrooks owned the house, they actually removed the loggia so that it was open from fireplace to fireplace. But we knew from Kipling's letters how important this room was to the house, so its reinstatement was very important to us as well. We managed to find all of that ash paneling and all of the pocket doors down at the Scott farm in one of the barns under 100 years of back guano. We found all of the doors except for one. We had to reproduce one of the pocket doors, and it was several years later when the former director was knocking on the door next door, Cook Cottage. Where's my Cook Cottage? There you go. That was the missing pocket door. This woman used to live in Cook Cottage. Yes, your front door was the missing pocket door. We thought about taking it with us, but we thought, oh, you know, we'll let you keep it. So the next room that we're going to try and go into is Mrs. Kipling's study. This room was sometimes called the Dragon's Chamber, and Mrs. Kipling was sometimes called the Dragon Lady. So they had a coffee maker! You're much bigger than the fourth graders, I have to say.
Well, now, I can't see it. How about you do? And you see that.
Great. Come on in, welcome.
Martha, where are you?
Right here. Mr. and Mrs. Kipling arrived here in Dummerston, Vermont in 1892. They had just gotten married in London, England, and they decided for their honeymoon they were going to go around the world. Mrs. Kipling's family lived here in Dummerston. Her brother lived across the road at a farm called Maplewood, and her grandmother lived down the road at a farm called Beechwood. You might have noticed a small sign still at the end of the driveway of Beechwood. Mr. Kipling fell in love with Vermont. He thought it was one of the most beautiful places he had ever seen. He once said that his two most favorite places in the world were Bombay, India, and Brattleboro, Vermont. When he came here, he was all of 28 years old and already the most famous author in the world. He was corresponding with the President of the United States, having tea with the Queen, and pretty much knew everyone of any influence during his day. Mr. Kipling decided, actually, on their around the world honeymoon tour, they were planning on making it to the South Pacific to see his friend Robert Louis Stevenson. They got as far as Japan when Mr. Kipling's bank failed. They had bought an around the world ticket and ended up using the last half of the ticket to come back to Vermont, where they decided that they would settle, raise their family, and build their dream home. He was quite wealthy at this time. He could have built any house that he wanted to build, but what he chose to build for himself was a house that looks like a ship. So it's 90 feet long and 22 feet wide, and imagine he would ride his ship house over the mountains of Vermont, having many wonderful journeys and writing about them, which is exactly what he did. When we purchased the house 21 years ago, it had been abandoned for 50 years. The entire south foundation had collapsed, and we had a family of raccoons living in here. But the curtains were still on the windows, the pictures were still on the walls, the furniture was still where they had left it, so it was pretty amazing. In 50 years, not one single window in the house got broken, until we owned it. We actually managed to break the first window in the property. So if oh, and here's another thing. So the house after the Kiplings went to the Holbrook family, and they made several changes to the house over the years. They put additions on and decks, We managed to find the original architectural plans in the architect's office in New York City, still filed under Kipling Cottage. So we knew exactly what the house looked like, and we have about 75 letters that Kipling wrote while he lived here, so we knew quite a few of the details of the inside and outside of the house. If Mr. Kipling were here today, you would recognize his house. It looks very much like it did when he lived here. And this is what we do with the kids. This stove hood was here, and this hearthstone was here, but how about this? Any ideas what the Kiplings cooked with and heated with while they lived here at Milwaukee?
Wood or coal?
Coal. Almost 1 ton per week in the wintertime. Not the most efficiently designed house for a cold Vermont winter. Although there was electricity in Brattleboro in 1892, it hadn't come out as far as Dummerston yet. Sort of like we still can't get cable out here today. So the placement of the windows was very important in the house. Kipling described these windows as wide and lavish, and even by today's standards, there are some pretty darn big windows in this house. This is the only window at the north end of the house. That lights the stairway that goes down into the basement. Normally you don't see windows on the inside of the house, but that allowed the light to carry through into the kitchen. These windows are somewhat unusual because they're way up high. They allow the light to come in, but you can't see out of them. And the reason why is because on the other side of this wall there's a patio where the Kiplings like to have their afternoon tea. And they didn't want the servants spying on them while they were out there, so these windows were up high. The Kiplings lived a very formal lifestyle at Nalaka. They had a maid who did the cooking and the cleaning, a nanny who took care of the children, and a coachman who took care of the horses, the sleighs, and the carriages. This is very unusual, even in 1892. This is a farming community, much like it is today, and it was as unusual to have 3 servants living in your home then as it would be today. This garnered a lot of interest with the neighbors, with the townspeople, with the local people. Kiplings were extremely private, which garnered even more interest in them. If you want to look over where Mrs. Vogt is, the kids love this. This is not original to Kipling. This was put in by the Holbrooks. They had moved the kitchen down into the basement, and this was Mr. Holbrook's office. And we always say to the kids, okay, what is that? Anyone know? Dumbwaiter. And why is it called a dumbwaiter? Not because it's stupid.
Doesn't talk back.
It's a waiter that doesn't speak. Excellent. You guys are good. If you'd like to follow Mrs. Vogt, we're going to attempt to go into... It'll probably come tomorrow.
I think what's a little disturbing is that I called twice. I talked to you, it was in the paper, and I just called to find out where the
Consider that.
It's kind of like a garage door with windows. Yeah.
Wow, Jack says
Let
we
me get
should...
you and Jack. Jack is right here.
Okay, now these shoes are not, this is icy. Oh, I'm not walking through there, not with these shoes. Muddy.
So this is the tennis court, and you can't see it from here, but there's a little plaque down there that says Michelle Imler once played here. Here is some building that has definitely collapsed. Probably over this winter. I think that's the original washer and dryer.
Well, I don't think they have it quite like that, but here's the distilled water for the for today's irons. Oh my God.
Oh, hello there.
Did you go, I went all the way up to the top. We have a game room
Oh, I'm game.
at the very top.
Which top, John?
I guess people are staying here.
Yes.
Is this your room?
Gonna grab a hand towel.
I'm gonna go out on the limb and say this is the master bath. Do you see the pictures of his kids?
Wonder where, is that here?
Well, I would think, well, there's a street light. Certainly gives that effect. Is it 3 bedrooms or 4? Oh, I love this clawfoot tub. Oh.
This is the laptop on which Kipling wrote. Bagheera and Gray Brother. Some of Kipling's golf clubs. Postcards.
And now we are in the front of Mr. Kipling's ship house, from where he could be the captain of his ship. And what is the front of the ship called? Bow. Excellent. If you look where Mrs. Vogt is right now, you can see a complete collection of Mr. Kipling's writings. He wrote novels, short stories, poems, songs, newspaper articles, and children's stories. It was very unusual in that day for serious authors to write for children. But as we already mentioned, Mr. Kipling loved his children as well as everybody else's children as well. He once said that he did not understand writer's block because he never got it. He just had this deep well of imagination that he could draw off anytime he wanted to. Now, if the light was coming through, you would see these panels of glass. They're actually Tiffany glass, and then we have the bookshelves underneath them. If we're standing outside of the house, we have regular 1/1 windows, just like in front of Mr. Kipling's desk. But he had them covered up almost immediately upon living here. Any idea why? Privacy. People used to spy on him. They would hide in the bushes up on the ridge here above the house and spy in on him while he was doing his writing. So we're going to go back into the loggia. Mr. Kipling's going to come say a few words to us, and then we're going to see a performance of the Just So story. Thank you. It is with great pleasure that I introduce to you today Mr. Rudyard Kipling.
Well, welcome, welcome, welcome. It's always a pleasure to open my home to people who appreciate a good story. And I like to tell the children they're on board my ship, because this is what I considered my home, a ship from which I've launched many fantastic voyages and adventures. And as a man who has traveled all over the world, I can say if you live anywhere in this neighborhood, you are very fortunate indeed, because I consider this to be one of the most beautiful places on the planet. If things had worked out a little bit more favorably for me here, I would have been more than happy to live out all my years right here on this beautiful hillside. And the room where you are sitting right now is my favorite room. It's the loggia, but I consider it the joy of the house. Children on the tour have a different name for it, because when they learn that these doors can close and that window can disappear into the ceiling upstairs, you can be outside on a porch. They call this the inside-out room, which I think is a lot more colorful. But whatever you call it, it was the joy of my home, and it's where we sat in the evening after the meal, and I would tell stories to my children, and they got very familiar with them, so much so that they insisted I tell those stories just so, which is why they became known as the Just So stories. And those stories are definitely meant to be told aloud, as was all of my verse and prose, and it was told many times before it hit the page. And there's one quote of mine I'd like to share with you. There is no line of my verse or prose which has not been mouthed till the tongue has made all smooth, and memory after many recitals has mechanically skipped the grosser superfluities. And if you can't quite wrap your head around what I'm going to say there, I'll say it more simply, is that I spoke them many times, which is the best way to edit something that's to be read aloud. And so it went through many orations before it hit the page. And in the process, I wrote down the way I said it, and I didn't always follow proper rules of pronunciation or grammar, particularly in the Just So stories. For example, in the story that you're going to hear about the elephant's child who asked ever so many questions, you could say that he was full of insatiable curiosity. But you'll note that on this page it says he was full of satiable courteosity. Similarly, the camel who's exceedingly lazy is described as being excruciating idle. Well, there was many liberties I took in my writing like that, and it just made it more fun to tell and more fun to listen to, and we all enjoyed it, but it didn't curry me much favor with the literary critics of the day, who thought I was a little bit too permissive. I had a little bit too much poetic license in my prose. As a matter of fact, in 1887, I submitted a manuscript to be published, of course. Well, it was returned. The editor saw fit to dismiss my entire submission with one word, one sentence. I'm sorry, Mr. Kipling, but you just don't know how to use the English language. Best alive. My firstborn, Josephine, was born right down the road here a bit while we were waiting for this house to be finished. We came from abroad, so I referred to her as my little American. And I had 2 more children, which I wrote these stories for. You know, it's one of the worst things in life is not to outlive your children. But I'd like to think that these writings that were sprinkled with all these endearments throughout the stories, that people who read them to their own best beloved, and when they grow up, read it to their best beloved, that perhaps many generations of readers and listeners can appreciate the affection and love which inspired them and for which they were created, and that they go on and on. So, as an example of a phrase being mouthed so it has made all smooth, in the story that you're going to hear about the elephant's child, he goes off on a grand adventure to the great gray, green, greasy Limpopo River. Now, it's fun to listen to that phrase, but it's even more fun to say it. Listen to it one more time, and I'm going to ask you to join me. The great gray, green, greasy Limpopo River, please. The great gray, green, greasy Limpopo River. It's almost musical, don't you think? Well, and just out of curiosity, how many of you have never heard the story of the elephant's child? There's always a few, and it's sad because there's many generations of people who have been deprived of this, especially the younger folks, which is why it's so wonderful that they're getting a chance to hear these timeless classics. Well, for those of you who have heard them before, I welcome you to enjoy them again, and for those who are hearing it for the first time, the stories, some children wonder whether they're true or not. And I will leave that to you to decide. I think there's a lot of truth in these stories myself. But anyhow, there is truth in the art of storytelling, and I am getting much too old to do justice to my writing. So I have asked another storyteller who is much younger and more spry to help interpret them for you tonight. And I'm going to ask him to come out, and I will come out later at the end of the program to share a little poem and something with you. But Mr. Gilman, yes, it's a lovely group. They're childish hearts. Yes, I can tell. They're over the top spies. They really come here and you have a child spirit. Like this, people. Thank you, Mr. Gilman. In the high and far off times, the elephant will best